So the Indianapolis 500 is one of the world's most prestigious racing events, and it forms 1/3 of motorsport's unofficial Triple Crown. It's also one of the oldest racing events in the world, having been held virtually every year since 1911. Now I say almost because there were some years the race wasn't held, namely because of two worldwide kerfuffles. It was not held in 1917 and 1918 due to the US joining the First World War, and again taking a break between 1942 and 1945. As a result, the race will hold its 107th running in 2023, instead of the 112th. And those are the only times that the race hasn't been held, which is a pretty good record. Races like the Monaco Grand Prix have not been held because of worldwide health scares, for instance, Le Mans being off the racing calendar due to industrial action or elections in one case, but for the Indy 500 to only be stopped because of the two world wars, that's pretty good going. And when the Formula One World Championship began in 1950, the Indy 500 was part of the championship. It's why the Formula One World Championship stats are skewed towards American drivers. Most of the American drivers on the stats with a win or a pole position are there because of the Indy 500. Something like over 50 drivers taking part in a World Championship event, even though the race was run under USAC rules. The European teams tended to avoid the race, and it's part of the reason why drop scores were introduced. So if they wanted to, they could miss the 500 or miss another race because of money and things like that, or just take part in another race. And at the time, this wasn't unheard of. In fact, it was rather common. And this is where an hot take can be inserted into this video. Because the racing world was a lot different and seasons were much shorter and I guess running teams was a lot cheaper, you would find the same drivers entering the same events. Moss and Fangio at Le Mans, for instance, John Surtees racing on 2 wheels and 4 wheels, Andretti doing ovals and road stuff, and Jim Clark driving and winning in... well, yes. And because of that ability to win in pretty much anything, I'm putting Clark and Andretti at the top of the greatest drivers debate along with Sebastian Loeb before I even begin to entertain the likes of Senna, Schumacher, Hamilton, and so on. And to bring all of this back home again in Indiana, see what I did there, Jim Clark had actually won the 1965 edition of this race. But moving on into 1966, which is the event that we're going to be looking at today, there was a British invasion. Sort of. Now, as mentioned in the Graham Hill Triple Crown video done a couple of weeks ago, the British invasion was an American media term for the likes of the Kinks, the Stones, the Beatles, Cliff Richard and Tom Jones invading the US charts and becoming insanely popular. In this instance, it was Jackie Stewart, Jim Clark and Graham Hill. And I know I'll be called biased for this, but you'd be hard pressed to find anybody in motorsport that would not have them on the list of the most complete drivers to ever climb into a racing car. All three would be multiple Formula One world champions, although at this point Hill only had the one championship, Clark had 2, and Stewart would get the first of his 3 in 1969. And that's a stat we might address later on in the video. Now, as mentioned, Clark had won in 1965 with Lotus, and the 2 Flying Scotsmen and the English Gentleman would arrive in Indiana to have a crack at this highly prestigious and very difficult to win event. It's not just turning left. This was also the 50th running of America's Great Race, and a big deal was made about it being the golden anniversary. In the run-up to the event, Johnny Rutherford would have a crash and would have to miss out due to injury, and practice started on the 30th of April 1966, so a full month before the actual race day. And then the first speeds started coming in at around 145 miles an hour in practice as an average speed over the lap, and then Stewart and Hill would have to do their rookie tests. Rookie tests are basically a way of getting people up to speed. The rookies go out and do 10 laps between 205 and 210 miles an hour in the modern Dallara IR18. That speed is then increased to 15 laps between 210 and 215, and then another 15 laps at basically full tilt. It's to make sure that the drivers can safely and consistently lap the oval. Dive into a corner too hot and you scrub off too much speed and ruin your tyres, and possibly cause an accident as well if the car behind is closing in too fast. And if you try to run before you walk, you're taking a one-way trip into a wall, which, even today, can be a gnarly experience. Sebastian Bourdais in 2017 breaking his hip in practice, and Scott Dixon's crash where, about a foot the other way, he'd have landed on a barrier with his head. Stewart passed his test on the 2nd of May, but I can't see a date for Hill passing his. Stewart and Hill were also teammates for this race, driving a Lola T90 for the John Mecom team. Mecom. This car only had a 4-speed gearbox, but it was geared super high so that it could hit the top speeds required for an oval. It also had a 4.2 litre Ford V8 in the back, fueled by methanol. I'm sure it was totally safe. Clark did the best of the 3 British drivers, putting his car in 2nd place in between Mario Andretti and George Snyder. Stewart was in 9th and Hill back in 15th. And other notable names on the grid for this race include Bobby Unser, Dan Gurney, Parnelli Jones, Al Unser, and AJ Foyt. And when it comes to the 1966 Indy 500, you tend to hear more about the start line crash. What happened was Billy Foster lost control trying to avoid Gordon Johncock and basically speared into the outside wall, whereupon he caused a massive pile-up. 16 cars, I think, were involved, and due to the risk of fire, AJ Foyt decided that he was going to try and scale the catch fencing to get away from being either run over and or incinerated. He was actually the only injury reported in the accident, and it wasn't from the accident, it was from doing his parkour over the fence. Gurney was on record as saying, "How 33 of the world's best drivers find it impossible to drive down a straight piece of track without running into each other beats the hell out of me." 11 cars were out of the race for good. 5 of them managed to get fixed up and take the restart, so it meant that 22 of the 33 managed to take the restart of the race. But then things got worse when Johnny Boyd spun at turn 1 and brought out the yellow. Like I said before, it seems that iRacing is pretty realistic after all. Eventually the race got running again, and Andretti led the first 16 laps. On lap 17, Clark took over the lead and was there until lap 65 when Lloyd Ruby then took over. Clark and Ruby would swap the lead a few times, but then on a lap 150, Ruby started having car trouble and that dumped him down the order. When Ruby went out of the race, the Brits were then 1, 2, 3, which drew the ire of some of the journalists in attendance. They were complaining that the Euros only came over for Indianapolis and didn't bother doing the rest of the season, while at the same time they were in awe as to how close Jackie Stewart could slipstream behind Clark's car. This being due to A, Jackie Stewart and Jim Clark were very, very, very close friends, and B, Jim Clark was probably the safest guy on track, if not the world. And it would be interesting to see how many accidents Jim Clark was involved in terms of collisions with another vehicle, where he was 100% to blame. It's probably a very low number, if not a 0. But interesting to find out either way. If you do know, do post it downstairs. But during this race, Clark would spin on lap 87, and this handed the lead to Ruby as Clark had to pit for fresh rubber. But still, Jimmy was able to get the lead back on lap 133, but would lose it again on lap 139. Ruby would be in the lead for the next 10 laps before his car started spewing smoke out the back and gifted the lead to Jackie. Once again, the purists were not happy. Nobody spins at Indianapolis and gets away with it. Unless you're Danny Sullivan, but he only spun once. Clark spun twice and survived. Now, Clark hadn't been happy with his car's handling all day, and oil on the track from Andretti probably didn't help things either. Stewart would be in the lead for 40 laps and pulled out a gap of nearly a lap ahead of everybody else, and that was when the dry sump started acting up. Basically, oil wasn't being fed into his engine, and it conked out. It's thought that Jackie was about to lap Graham, his teammate at BRM in Formula One, but Graham wasn't having any of it, so Graham decided he was going to speed up. Stewart wanted to lap Hill and tried too hard to keep up, and it's thought that this caused the oil pump to give out. Stewart was just 10 laps away from being the first rookie since 1927 to win the Indy 500. Instead, it was the other British rookie, Hill, that was in the lead, and in a shock to nobody, the purists in the audience weren't happy about that either, because Hill had barely made an on-track pass all day to get where he was, managing to get to the front thanks to half the field being wiped out at the first start, and then picking up places thanks to Andretti retiring on lap 27, Clark spinning, and now Stewart having car troubles. Hill crossed the line at the end of lap 200 to take the victory, with Clark in second place behind. But when Clark arrived in victory lane, he found that the Lola of Hill was already there, and confusion set in. In the original Triple Crown video I did about 2 weeks ago now, I said that there was a bit of controversy as to over who won the 1966 Indy 500. Lotus was adamant that Clark had won, despite Hill already being there in victory lane. Lotus's timing sheets showed that Clark was nearly a lap ahead of Hill as opposed to the other way around, which is what USAC was saying was the case. Now at this time, GPS trackers, electronic timing, and all the stuff we take for granted to show us exactly what's happening in the race on the screen at home on our TV screens, like we see with Formula One and all that stuff, it was all done with stopwatches, pencils, and pieces of paper. Now, Helen Stewart, Jackie's wife, was often seen with a stopwatch at Formula One Grand Prix. The famous timing tower Indy was all updated manually and was not official timing in any shape, form, or description. It was a guideline, and Lotus felt they'd got that wrong. It was a guideline, and it's thought that Lotus thought that it was official. The timing tower often updated sporadically through the race, which must have caused some confusion for anyone watching, as it constantly chopped and changed as the timing was updated. The word provisional probably doesn't apply here. There is one theory due to the fact that both Al Unser and Clark were driving identical cars. When Unser crashed out of the race on lap 161, the official timekeepers thought that it was Clark and didn't score Jimmy for that lap, instead adding one lap to Unser before they realised the mistake. Now apparently Clark's car had white tyre sidewalls to eliminate that kind of confusion. There's also a theory that they gave Clark an extra lap instead of Unser early in the race. From looking around on the internet at these theories, it's actually quite possible that Lotus never saw Hill pass Clark when Clark spun. There was also further controversy, as there was reports going around that Gordon Johncock was the true winner of that year's Indy 500. He'd started the race from the pit lane at the restart and had run the 500 in the fastest lap time in history at that point. But there were rumours that the scorers hadn't scored his first lap, meaning that he'd raced one lap behind everybody else the whole time. And afterwards, Tony Hallman, the owner of IMS, found a way to pay Hill and Johncock the winner's prize in a little bit of hush money, as USAC had apparently gone, "Yeah, you won the race, not those pesky tea drinkers." But Johncock would later deny ever receiving any money, basically saying, "Yeah, I might have won, but I never got paid for it." But even Hill was surprised to be in the winner's circle drinking the milk, because in his own words, he'd endured quite an uneventful race. His prize money for the race was enough that he supposedly went straight from Indianapolis down to Wichita in Kansas to put a cash deposit down on a Cessna 206. So eventually USAC published the official race results, which showed Graham Hill the winner, nearly a lap ahead of Jim Clark, and not the other way around as Lotus had claimed, and Chapman actually withdrew his protest. Afterwards, when everybody had got home, there was the typical house party at the Hill household in London, where Jim Clark was photographed enjoying himself, drinking, and even bouncing a young Damon Hill on his knee. And during the dinner that was happening at the time, Graham apparently said that this cheque is bigger than the one I was anticipating, but at least I've got two Scottish accountants to help me out with it. Also in Motorsport magazine, there was a worry that America's Great Race could end up being, well, not so American anymore. Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon were at the race thinking they could have a crack for 1967, and Mr. Honda said that he was going to have a car built for the 1967 race. On top of this, the front row of the grid was made up of 3 British-made chassis, a Brabham and 2 Lotuses. There were worries that the myth of Indianapolis will become history and live only in the minds of those who can remember the golden days. But I don't know, give it another 30 years or so. I don't know why I did that, but I'm going to leave it in. But anyway, this has been a video on the 1966 Indy 500. If you've enjoyed this video about the time Indy came home just before, coincidentally, football came home, then do give the video a like. And if you want to see more from this channel and the stuff I do here, get subscribed and get that bell on as well, so never miss out on a future video. Massive thanks as ever to the kind folk at Patreon, and if you want to help out with the image purchases, a link to Patreon will be down in the description along with my socials and also Discord. Well, there's super thanks as well if you just want to buy me a coffee or a pint. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Bye.